Hello, I'm Brian Watrous of VMware Education. In this video, we're going to learn how to integrate Orchestrator workflows with vSphere infrastructure. This video is the final video in a series of videos in which we've been exploring vCenter Orchestrator. And in this video, we're going to do essentially two things. We're going to learn how to put together all the various things that we've learned thus far. And additionally, we're going to explore the vCenter plugin, which is going to enable us to integrate our Orchestrator workflow with our vSphere infrastructure. The vCenter plugin is included with Orchestrator, and what it allows you to do is to enable your workflows to tap into the power of the vSphere Web Services API. That's the same API that tools such as the vSphere client use to communicate with your vCenter server and your vSphere infrastructure. Through that API, your Orchestrator workflows will be able to do things such as clone virtual machines, deploy virtual machines from templates, power them on, power them off. But not only will you be able to administer virtual machines, the API allows you to administer hosts, data stores, clusters. Essentially, you can do everything in your Orchestrator workflows that you could do from the vSphere client itself. Now, as we go through this portion of the video and the demonstrations that will follow, part of what I want to do is introduce you to some of the tools that Orchestrator developers use. Additionally, I want to introduce you to some of the thought process that developers go through as they create Orchestrator workflows that integrate with vSphere. So we begin with this particular tool, a tool called the API Explorer. The API Explorer is available in the Orchestrator client. And what the API Explorer does is it provides extensive documentation about all the plugins. For instance, in this screenshot, you can see we're looking at the vCenter plugin. Specifically, we're looking at an object called a VC virtual machine. Now, we'll look in the API Explorer in more detail in the demonstration coming up, but effectively what we have here is a tool that documents everything that you need to know about the various objects that we're going to interact with, whether those are virtual machines, hosts, or what have you. And in addition, the API Explorer is not limited to just documenting vSphere and vCenter items, but other plugins can integrate their documentation with the API Explorer. So you have in the API Explorer one place to go where you can learn everything that you need to know about integrating with the various parts of your infrastructure that you'll do through Orchestrator workflows. But to get into the API Explorer, you simply open up the Orchestrator client and go to the menu and select Tools, API Explorer. Another tool that's available to Orchestrator developers to help you better understand the vCenter plugin is a tool called the Orchestrator Inventory. Like the API Explorer, the Orchestrator Inventory is also accessible through the Orchestrator client. In the Orchestrator client, if you select the design view, you'll see the same 6 tabs we've seen previously in the videos before this one, but the rightmost tab is where you go to see the Orchestrator Inventory. Now, any Orchestrator developer that develops a plugin can choose to integrate their plugin into this inventory view. In the screenshot, we can see that the SSH plugin, the vCenter server plugin, and the SQL plugin have all integrated into the Orchestrator Inventory. In the screenshot, we've furthermore expanded the vCenter plugin so that you can see through this inventory that we can see the vCenter servers, the data centers, the clusters, the hosts, the VMs. We can see through this inventory, through the vCenter plugin, all the same objects that you're probably accustomed to seeing in the vSphere client. So we're going to focus in the presentation right now on the vCenter server, but many of these same techniques that we're going to use to explore vCenter also work for the other plugins such as AMQP, the vCloud Director plugin, and so forth. As vSphere administrators, you're accustomed to seeing your inventory or your infrastructure through the vSphere client. So over on the left side of this screen, we see the vSphere client inventory, in which we can see our vCenter server, our data center, which is called My Data Center, our cluster, My Cluster, our host, ESXi01, and a pair of virtual machines. Now, that inventory that we see in the vSphere client is actually not stored in the vSphere client. It's stored in your vCenter server. So what we're looking at with the vSphere client is the vCenter inventory. That same vCenter inventory is visible through the Orchestrator Inventory. If you go into the Orchestrator client and go into that Orchestrator Inventory view and start expanding the vCenter plugin, you'll see the same objects. But you'll notice if you compare the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen here that there's much more information in the Orchestrator Inventory. The vSphere client is purposely designed in order to make the user experience easier by not overwhelming the user with information that they don't need to know. The administrator does not need to know, a typical vSphere administrator doesn't need to know all the level of detail that we see through the Orchestrator Inventory. But the Orchestrator Inventory gives us that full detail. It shows us exactly what's going on in the vCenter inventory, shows us intervening levels that we don't see in the vSphere client. And that's important to us as Orchestrator workflow developers because you need to understand the hierarchy of objects as the vCenter server and your workflows view that inventory. So let's start examining this inventory and then we'll get into some demos. So at the top level of the vSphere client interface, you have your vCenter server. Now notice the corresponding object in the Orchestrator inventory is not the topmost object, but the second object. So the two highlighted objects here are your vCenter server. The next object down, when viewing the inventory through the vSphere client, is your data center. Now, you'll notice in the Orchestrator inventory that there's an intervening object. In this case, it's labeled data centers. Now, not many customers use this, but in the vSphere client, instead of simply creating a data center, if you have multiple data centers, you can organize those in something called a data center folder. And that's what you're actually seeing on the right side in the Orchestrator inventory. The object labeled data centers is a data center folder. Now, that data centers folder is actually a special data center folder. That data centers folder is created automatically by default. It's visible in the Orchestrator client, but it's hidden from you if you're using the vSphere client. Every vCenter server in the world has at least one data center folder. It will always be called data center folders, and any additional data center folders that you create will show up as children of the data centers folder that's created by default. In the vSphere client, the next object down is your cluster. And again, on the right side, we can see where that shows up in the Orchestrator inventory. And notice once again that between the My Data Center object and this cluster, my cluster, there's an intervening object labeled host. Now, host is, once again, a folder that's created for you automatically by default, but it's hidden from you if you're using the vSphere client. That host folder can hold standalone hosts, or in the case that we see here, our host folder is holding a cluster. So the host folder holds either standalone hosts or cluster objects. Our cluster object is labeled My Cluster, and if we continue down through the inventory, over on the left side in the vSphere client, we see our host, which is called ESXi01, and on the right side in the Orchestrator inventory, we see the same object, and we can continue drilling deeper and deeper into the inventory. But ultimately, what I've come in here to show you is that in the vCenter inventory, you won't see this in the vSphere client, but you'll see it in the Orchestrator inventory. The vCenter inventory has numerous folders, data center folders, host folders, VM folders, data store folders, network folders. There are multiple folders that are created automatically by default, but they're hidden from vSphere client administrators. But we need to know that these are here. You'll see shortly in the demonstration why it's important. But please remember that there are these intervening objects when looking in the Orchestrator inventory view. Notice there's one other object in here. The object labeled resources is a resource pool. It functions in effect like a folder in that it's a container for holding, in this case, resource pools, but it's a folder like these others in that it's created by default. but hidden from vSphere client users. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series to learn more about vCenter Orchestrator. For in-depth, hands-on Orchestrator training, enroll in the VMware vCenter Orchestrator Develop Workflows class and connect with other Orchestrator developers online at communities.vmware.com. Thank you.